But I also feel like it's been in the last year, I feel like, especially since George Floyd's murder, it's something that's been really heavy on my heart and something that I think people are a little bit more open to. So I wanted to talk about that. And so what I'd like to do actually is have you all do an activity at the very beginning. I'm just going to warn you, this is a very interactive session. If you just want to sit by and kind of be a bump on a log, you might want to pick a different session because I'm going to ask you to participate here. So I'll be looking at the chat because I'm asking you to, I see somebody says they don't see anything. Do you all see my screen? Are you all able to see the image that's on my screen of a street? Yes, no? Okay, perfect. All right, so, okay, great. So what I want you to do is I want you to think about this image that you see on the screen. And what I want to do is just ask a couple people if they'd be willing to volunteer to describe what they see on the screen. So for this first image, is there anyone who's willing to tell me what you see, how you interpret that image, and to tell me to evaluate it? Is there anyone who's willing to do that?
Hi, Carmen. This is Justin from the Ohio Department of Higher Education.
Okay, perfect. Thank you, Justin.
Oh, when I see an image like that, I immediately just one word pops up in my head. It's danger.
Okay.
You know, and I don't know exactly why, but I just wouldn't want to walk up a street like that, even though it's well lit. I just know from my personal history, you know, things that have happened. So.
Okay, perfect. Is there anyone who's, thank you very much for that, Justin. Is there anyone who has a different reaction to that?
It made me feel happy. I see a city, probably a lot of exciting things going on. People, you know, maybe getting together. I don't know. I thought it looked cool.
All right. Thank you both for that. So this is really, really interesting. Every time I do this activity, I typically do this with my undergraduate students who are typically middle income suburban kids who are going into an urban school for a placement. And so I use a slide, and it's really interesting, this group, because I typically get the opposite reaction. So usually the males in the group are like, oh, well, you know, it's kind of a pain to parallel park every time you leave your apartment, or I don't see any good restaurants on the street. And the women are like, what are you talking about food? I'm thinking about my own personal safety, right? So I use this image because I feel like we all have different perceptions of this one street. It's neutral. We don't know if any crime has ever been committed on this street, but we all have an initial gut reaction to what we're seeing, right? And the reason we have that gut reaction is because that's how our bodies are wired. When we first get on this planet as little babies, we start to learn the world, and we begin to categorize things in our minds based on what they are, right? So we eat everything when we're kids, and we learn, oh, that's in the eat pile, and this is going in the never eat again pile, right? So we learn the world by categorizing things, and we categorize things based on characteristics that they have in common. So if you have had an experience on a street or in the dark, or you've heard of an experience where you feel like being out at night is threatening, you're going to have a different reaction to this very neutral image than someone who's maybe lived on a street like this. I had a student from out of the country who said, oh, that's definitely a European street. It makes me think of travel and great food, right? So my point is, no matter, we can all look at this picture very differently. We're all going to look through a very different lens based on the experiences that we've had with a similar street, based on who we are as people. Most men are going to look at this image and not think about their safety, because men have the privilege for the most part of moving through this world without having to worry about their daily safety. Whereas women are constantly thinking, I'm going to cross the street and not walk past those three guys, and that kind of thing. So just this beginning exercise is just meant to demonstrate the ways that we perceive things differently based on our own experiences, based on the things we've learned, based on the things we've heard, based on the thing that the media tells us, right? So if we only hear stories of women being attacked, or men, period, people being attacked on dark streets, it starts to form an understanding on us. So we judge dark streets differently Then we do streets that are well lit and maybe less crowded. Okay, is everyone following so far? Okay, all right, so I'm gonna go to this next image. What are your thoughts and reactions? You can just put them in the chat. What are your thoughts and reactions? Is there any, and then if there's someone who would like to speak, feel free. All right, I see safety, calm, peacefulness, peaceful place of worship. Marvelous, quiet, yes. So again, this is a neutral image. This church isn't good or bad, but we may all have very different reactions to it. I had one student who's was actually raised in a Catholic church with a very Catholic family, and he was a victim of abuse. So he doesn't look at this church and see peacefulness and safety. He looks at it and he sees that lack of safety and lots of anxiety. If you're LGBTQIA, you may be looking at that as a place of judgment, not as a place of refuge. So again, our own individual experiences shape how we see a thing. Here's another image. What are your thoughts? Someone said stifling, uncomfortable. Yes, absolutely, it can be. So what about this image? This is a foreign police officer. What are the feelings and thoughts that this image evokes? So again, helpful policeman, caring. So it helps a whole lot that this policeman has a smile on his face, right? He looks like he might have been plucked right out of Mayberry. So we all, again, can have very differential reactions to, someone wrote discomfort. We all have very different reactions to the police even. So in some communities in this country, people won't call the police. There have been stories I know where women have been victims of domestic violence. And if their partner is African American, they're not calling the police because they're like, I want him to not hurt me, but I don't want him to be killed. So we all have very different reactions, again, based on where we are. How about this image? What do you think of in this image? What are your thoughts? Lunch. Well, yeah, we're about we're in that space. Good food, beautiful. So I'm going to just share a personal experience for me. I actually shared this experience on Facebook and got such a strong reaction that I included in this slideshow. So it is not uncommon. I can tell you at least 7 or 8 times in my adult life where I've gone to the grocery store and stood at the deli counter and waiting in line, and maybe they're not doing the now serving, take a number thing, but I'm standing there and I'm waiting, and then someone comes up behind me and the clerk looks right past me to ask that person, may I help you? Okay. Or once I was in a Bruegger's Bagel, and they have a little bell on the door. So I walked through the door and the bell rang and I got to the counter and no one ever came up to the counter. So then the bell rang again and this woman comes in behind me. She happened to be blonde, and the person looked up from what they were doing and looked at us both and went to the blonde woman and said, oh, how can I help you? And as if I clearly was in line first, but she didn't even acknowledge my presence, nor make an attempt to help me. So that's what the deli counter image evokes for me. I posted about it on Facebook because I wondered if it was really a unique experience. And all of my Black friends said, oh, girl, yeah, that happens to me all the time. It's like I'm invisible sometimes. Maybe when people say they don't see color, they mean they don't see me at all. It happens a lot too. I see Regina Johnson saying, yep, it's happened to me too. So again, something that's very neutral, something that evokes really warm and fuzzy feelings for a lot of people can really create an emotional reaction from someone else. Okay, and then last, this isn't the last one, but looking at these stairs, what are you thinking when you see these stairs? What does it make you think of? For me, I think I start thinking of that's a good place to exercise. It looks like, we're always looking, my running group is always looking for stairs. Someone says a women's career progression. That's really, really nice. Diana's saying, yep, this would wear me out. Justin says it reminds him of court. So yes, absolutely, this image can mean something very different to every one of us. But I use the image because I think probably one of the biggest groups in this country is the folks who are non-disabled. And our entire world is focused on the non-disabled for the most part. So we look at this and we don't think of access. We don't think, I couldn't get into that building, but someone who's in a wheelchair would approach this stairwell with a completely different mindset, right? And I think about the fact that as a person who is non-disabled, I never think about access. I never get an invitation to someone's house and think about how am I going to get there, or where is there parking, or is there a curb cut so that I can get my wheelchair over from the street to the curb. I never think about those kinds of things because I am not a non-disabled person. Okay, so the next one. What about this image? What does this evoke? What kinds of feelings, emotions? What does it make you think of? Excuse me. Bad health and too many choices. Financial stability. Oh, that's a good one. All right. So I'm just thinking, again, for someone who is often in the grocery store trying to reach the cat food that's on the very, very top shelf, being someone who is vertically challenged in the physical, but not in the spiritual, right? I'm 6'3" spiritually, but 5'3" physically. I always think of that. I always think of how they put the things that I want. It seems like the things I want are almost always on the shelf. So as a person who's not very tall, that is something that I think about all the time. But for someone who's very tall, that's not something that they have to consider. So all of this to say that we all belong to different groups. And as we belong to different groups, that group identity, we're inside the group sometimes, we're outside of a group the other times, right? So when we have when we're part of a dominant group. The dominant group is the group that the majority of people are in, okay? And then the non-dominant group is the group that fewer people are in. So being non-disabled, and I use the term non-disabled because it feels like the most inclusive term to use. So I feel like people who are non-disabled may have kind of a surface understanding of what it feels like to be disabled. Like we can imagine what it's like to have access, but we don't really see all the different ways that people are limited in access if they're in a wheelchair, right? In the same way, men can kind of have some idea of what it might feel like to be sexually harassed or sexually assaulted. And there are some men who've experienced it themselves. But for the most part, women are the ones who have that experience. So they have a deeper understanding of what that will look like. It's the same thing with experiences between people of different racial backgrounds. If your racial background is a dominant racial background, you may see kind of things that happen on the surface, but you don't always know what lies beneath because you're not having those everyday experiences that make you remember that you are part of the non-dominant group. So we're going to add just a little bit of complexity to that. We all have different identities, but we also have intersecting identities. And so the idea of intersectionality is that, so when you're in the dominant group, the world is kind of designed for your group. As non-disabled people, the world kind of works for us, right? So in a way, because the world is designed for us, it can be very oppressive to someone who is disabled, okay? So when I say oppression, I don't mean oppression like, people are in bondage. I mean oppression in terms of you don't have the same equitable access. You don't have the same type of justice as a person who's in a different group. You don't have the same experiences. So with intersectionality, it means that those things are layered, okay? So if I am a Black female who is in a wheelchair, my experiences are going to be like, there will be layers of access that are impeded for me. Does that make sense to everybody? Are you guys following me on that? I'll wait for a yes, no, something in the group chat. Okay, perfect. All right, so the idea of intersectionality is that no one is just one thing. We're all several things at once, and those things are layered and intersecting and make things complicated. And really the idea of intersectionality came out of the feminist movement. And a lot of what came out of that was that African-American women were involved in the civil rights movement, but the men in civil rights movement were kind of ignoring the experiences of women and how women experience racial discrimination differently. And so Black women who were involved in the feminist movement were also finding that white women experienced sexism in different ways than Black women experienced it. So the white women in the feminist movement were thinking about things like, well, the the ideas of what it felt like to be a homemaker, and the Black women were like, well, I am a homemaker, but I work outside of my home, so being a homemaker isn't my bigger issue. It's like, where do I fit? I don't fit in the all Black male world, and I don't fit in the all female world. I'm kind of an intersection of those two things. So we're all impacted by these different layers of identity. Okay, so what does that really mean? It means that our experiences will be very different. So think of the experience. These are two men. They're both white. They're both men. They're both cisgender, meaning that they were born biologically men and they identify as men. And they're also both straight. Okay. But their experiences are going to be very different because one is wealthy and one is poor. Okay, so you have to think about the fact that when someone is experiencing, bias, that they could be experiencing on a couple different levels, and that our experiences are just going to be very different based on what our lenses are and where our positionality is. All right. Okay. Trying to keep my eye on the chat here. So when we're able to look through the world with an intersectional lens, it's the things that we do to try to create justice for one group can actually create more oppression for another group. So it's helpful to look through an intersectional lens and to think about, if I'm making decisions, if I'm making a policy decision, maybe to have an evening class. And let's say, for example, we're thinking about having an evening class, and we say, oh, well, yeah, we can definitely have an evening class, but we may not consider the fact that we're in a remote location. It makes it difficult for students who are on the bus to get to it. Maybe our female students won't feel very comfortable. There's not a lot of lighting outside. So we may be looking at implementing an educational policy to make access available for some students, but not realizing that we're actually creating that same policy creates barriers for other students. So it's being able to look through multiple different lenses. The easiest way to do that, the easiest way to consider all lenses is to have more, I'm sorry, there's still people entering the session. It's a little bit distracting. There's still, the best way to be able to make sure that you're looking through intersectional lens is to make sure that the people who are making decisions are an intersection of your population. So you don't want just one group of folks making all of the decisions because they won't be considering different perspectives. It is good when we have multiple perspectives at the planning table. So we haven't actually talked about bias specifically up to this point because I wanted to lay the foundation that we are all alike in some ways, we're all different in some ways, and most of us don't have really a whole lot of choice didn't have a lot of choice in who we are, right? So we were born as a certain gender. We were born with a certain belief system. We were born into a wealthy family or a poor family. So a lot of those things that make us different aren't necessarily our choice, okay? But because of those differences, we're all going to see the world differently. We'll see events and experiences differently, just like we saw and perceived the images at the beginning of the slideshow. It doesn't mean that what you're seeing isn't there. It means that I'm looking at it through a different lens. Oh my gosh. Are you all still there? Is everybody still there? Okay. I'm sorry. I just got the message that my internet, I've never had a problem with my internet before in my life. Of course, in the middle of a presentation, I would get that message. So my point is that because if you're not able to see someone's perspective, it doesn't mean that their perspective is incorrect. And that's kind of the basis that we have to have conversations about diversity from. That if you don't see what someone else sees, it isn't because what they see isn't there. It's because you're not looking through their lens. And so what that means is you have to kind of take a step back and say, tell me how you experience this, because, and I can talk about a lot of experience. I grew up in Cleveland Heights. And for anyone who's not from the Cleveland area, Cleveland Heights is sort of like, it has a reputation for being a very diverse and accepting community and very integrated and things like that. And most of the people who went to my high school had a very similar experience of that. Most of the people who were in my high school, that's how they narrate their lives. I mean, it was great growing up with Black and white and Jewish neighbors and East Indian neighbors. It was nice having Asian friends. It was cool that we all hung out on Coventry together. But our experiences were very, very different. So in high school, there was a program called the International Baccalaureate Program. And in that program, it was a very intensive program that was designed to help us all get college credits while still in high school. So it was very rigorous. There were not a lot of people of color in it. I would ask my friends of color, why are you not in this program? They'd say, because I can struggle in that class for C's, or I can stay in expanded classes and get straight A's. Good luck, in your classes. But in those classes, my experiences were very, very different from the other Black kids in the school, because I would be like one of 2 or 3 Black kids in a class of 40. And so I would be talking about how something happened in our community and how it impacted me differently. And my experience was completely dismissed. And it wasn't ever, and it was really frustrating because my teachers at the time were not the people who would say, well, maybe she's looking at it through a different lens. Can you kind of help explain, what it is that you're seeing? So it's very easy to get into it's very easy to have conversations about diversity and difference and race if we all recognize that everyone is looking through a different lens. And I really like this image, because when you're looking through a lens, you're seeing a bird's eye view. You're missing the periphery, right? So if we can all keep in mind that our lenses make some things very clear for us, but make other things quite blurry, then it's easier to have conversations about race, diversity, equity, and inclusion. Okay, so bias is actually defined as a prejudice in favor for or against a person or a group compared to another group, and usually in a way to be unfair. We all have biases. We can't not have them. It is just how we're programmed, okay? So the problem isn't with having bias. The problem is with acting on that bias in a way that creates inequity or inequality for someone else. Okay, so explicit bias is what most of us are used to. Explicit bias is that when a person is very clear about their attitudes and beliefs, and their behaviors are exactly in line with those beliefs. And it could be favorable or unfavorable, okay? So if you have a bias and your actions are in line with your bias, that's considered an explicit bias. And if you ask most people feel more comfortable with explicit bias, because at least with explicit bias, your enemy, right? And so one of the things I think that if you're paying attention to a lot of what's happening in these conversations, there's a woman, her name is Robin DiAngelo, and she's written a book called White Fragility. And in her book, one of the things that she talks about is that, actually the reason that she wrote the book is because she's been doing diversity work in school districts and communities for years and years and years. And she always said that the most difficult conversations that she had were with people who think that they already are, like they're not racist. I'm not racist at all. Someone who's racist, that's explicit bias. The other thing is, it's difficult to have conversations about race, or people aren't open to the idea of race and bias, because when we say that someone is racist, they automatically think that means, well, I'm a horrible person, right? Racism is more about systems of power and oppression, and it does require individual actors, but it is larger and much more systemic than people really realize. So With explicit bias, the person's very clear about their intentions. The implicit bias is the part that I think is more dangerous, more insidious, because it's harder to see and people are more likely to deny it, okay, or be unaware of it. So probably the best example of implicit bias, I would think, would be the doll study. Have any of you ever heard of the doll study? I'm sorry, I'm letting someone else in. Anyone in the, can you tell me in the chat, have you heard of the doll study before? Yes, okay, so I'm sorry. I'm trying to use two screens, one to monitor the people who are coming in, and my mouse is not wanting to cooperate and go back to the other screen. Okay, so implicit bias is unconscious. It's not, it's just below the surface. You may not even be aware that it exists. And it basically operates outside of your awareness. And it usually contradicts your declared beliefs. So you may say, you will deny all day that you have any kind of bias in you whatsoever. You know, this is the audience that Robin DiAngelo is targeting. Makes me think of really not too long ago, a friend of mine posted on, well, I'll say this, probably a year ago. There seemed to be lots of cases of politicians, high school and college pictures coming up where they were in blackface, okay? So I went to school with a young lady who did a performance for Martin Luther King in blackface when we were in middle school. When she did the performance, everyone was really, you know, like my little peer group, we were all really uncomfortable with this performance. Like, why, if she could wear this suit, why couldn't she just wear her own face? But our teacher, our history teacher, was a Black female, and she was like encouraging and supporting her. So we didn't say anything about it. So fast forward, God knows how many years, and we're Facebook friends. And so she, because of all of these news stories that were coming out about people in blackface, she just kind of really wanted to own up to that. And so she posted that, you know, that this had happened, that her mother had kind of tried to discourage her, but that she felt like it was something she really wanted to do. And she wore the suit, so she wanted to wear the skin color as well. And she really just wanted to transform herself into Martin Luther King Jr. The teachers didn't stop her. So she did this performance and she really did a wonderful job of the I Have a Dream speech, but it really kind of left a bad taste in the mouth of a lot of our students. And so she was owning that and saying that she apologized to anyone who felt uncomfortable or what have you. So one of her friends, who's actually like in our parents' age, one of her friends, her Facebook friends, told her, you know, you don't have to apologize for anything. You don't, you know, that was, you were a kid and you didn't know. Okay. So, but with bias, your intent doesn't matter. What matters is the impact. And so if you're in a conversation with someone who's saying, you know, I felt a little offended by that comment, your intent isn't what's important. What's important is the impact. So get the impact right and then focus on your intent the next time, okay? Because what happens when you focus on your intent is you ignore what other people's feelings, okay? So you ignore the impact of it. So I can say, oh, I didn't intend to shoot you, but you're still shot, right? You still have a bullet hole in your body. So going back to this Facebook post, another friend who was familiar with Robin DiAngelo's work said to her, you know, you absolutely should be apologizing to your friends because the damage that you did was done decades ago and it isn't even really going to help them right now. What should have happened is you should have apologized to them then. So the friend who told her she didn't owe anyone an apologize and the friend who said she should kind of got into a nice long debate. And at the end of throughout the debate, the friend who said you don't need to apologize was saying, well, the friend who told her she should apologize was saying to the other friend, you're making this about yourself and it isn't about you, because she went to like, I have, you know, my son-in-law is Black and I have biracial grandchildren and I do theater with Black people. And so there's no way that I'm ever being offensive. And what's true is you can be Black and be offensive to another Black person. What's true is you can be a female and discriminate against a female because of her gender. So it isn't about what all your experiences are, what your connections are. Having Black grandchildren doesn't put you in the same position and shoes as someone who is a person of color. So if they're saying to you that here is the impact of your words, the conversations about bias begin with us saying, I hear that. That isn't my experience. I hear that and I apologize. And how do we move on from here? This gets trickier in education because our students are on a different playing field and they may not have the comfort level to say, I found your comments to be distressing or disturbing. So with this doll study, what happened was there were two doctors, this was in the 1940s, there were two doctors who wanted to demonstrate the impacts of bias. And eventually their work was used to talk, well, so they were talking about the impacts of discrimination on Black children. So what happens is we all learn messages from our family members, we get messages from our peer group, we get messages from the media, right? And those messages tell us different things about ourselves, different things about society, and we internalize those messages without even thinking about it. Okay, so with the doll study, what they did is they presented pictures of children, so you can kind of see the pictures that they presented. So it's the exact same drawing of a doll, I mean of a child. With the study, they use baby dolls, but with the study with Anderson Cooper, they use pictures. But it was the same baby doll, but one was Black, one was white. And in this study here with Anderson Cooper, they use the same images, just different colors, different skin tones. And so what they do is they ask the kids questions, and the questions might be, which girl would you like to play with? And so the kids point to a picture. Which child is the good child? And they point to that picture. Which child do you think is the bad child? And so they're asking these questions and the children are reacting to it. And what they found over and over again with Black children and white children is that we associate whiteness with goodness and rightness, and we associate badness and criminality with the darker complexion folks. Okay, so this study was done in the 1940s. Anderson Cooper repeated it in 2015, I think it was, and it still holds. And what that means, what that tells me is that the biases that we have that are fed to us through our society, they're so ingrained that even decades later, with all of the things that we've done to try to correct it, it's not going to correct itself. Okay, so I'll give another example of when we have, you know, when you're watching commercials or when you're watching TV, the things that you see on TV may or may not represent you, okay? And because of what you see on TV, you start to form values and opinions. Remember, I talked before about how we categorize things when we're younger. We categorize things. These are the things that are food items, and these are the things that I shouldn't put in my mouth, right? This is the four-legged furry animal that won't bite me, and this is the furry four-legged animal that might, right? This is the little cute animal that belongs inside my house, and these are the ones that belong outside my house. We use that as a way, our brains use that as a way to process information very quickly. So the things that we're fed in our environment, the things that we learn, we create these different narratives, we create these stories, we create these stereotypes, and those stereotypes impact us whether we understand it or not. I started to send everyone the link to the Harvard Implicit Association test because it's kind of a doll study for adults. And it's really kind of a bizarre test, which is why I didn't send it. And basically you're presented with two images on the screen, or you're presented with an image on the screen, and you have to push on your computer keyboard, E if it's a Black image, I if it's a white image. Then they give you words, and you have to put E if they're a bad image and I if it's a good image. And then they switch the button. So now I is the bad and E is the good, and they whatever. So you do all of this button pushing, and at the end of it, they tell you, hey, you're most likely in, you actually have a mild pro-white bias, okay? So I took this test and mine came out as having a mild pro-white bias. Now, I am all about African-American history and self-love and things like that, but I still have a pro-white bias, which is really strange based on this Harvard test. But it's understandable because we're constantly fed images through the media of what's good and what's bad. I started to, during Hurricane Katrina, these images were represented in the newspaper. In one image, it was a picture of a Black man walking by himself, chest deep in water with a couple things that he'd gotten from this store. In the second image, there's an image of a white couple, and they're also chest deep in water, and they've got supplies that they're holding over their heads. In one story, in the story with the white couple, the caption was, here's this couple trying to finding food in the middle of all of this chaos. The caption under the Black man was, here's this man looting for food, same conditions, same hurricane, but they were finding food and he was looting food. That's all a part of our programming. And a lot of it can be very unconscious. Even though some of it can be very, some of it can be very explicit, a lot of it is subconscious. And it's because we've been fed these messages our entire lives and we've internalized those messages. There is internalized inferiority and there's internalized superiority, where you believe that your race, your gender, your sexual orientation is better than the other because those are the messages you've been told your whole entire life. In terms of representation, for me growing up, I didn't see little girls who looked like me on TV until The Facts of Life came on, and then little Tootie was on The Facts of Life, and Tootie was every little Black girl's role model because she was the girl that we saw on TV. So that representation matters because it impacts you in different ways. When you think about a woman with beautiful hair, what do you think of? You probably think of the blondes in the shampoo commercial who are, just kind of shaking it, right, for the nation. So all of those messages tell us something. They tell us what beauty is. It tells us that, it tells us what's good, what's bad. It puts those values on things that really don't have value, and we internalize those values, and it operates in our bias. So with this doll study, what they found was that there is definitely a bias towards lighter complected people, and that we associate good things with those folks, and that we associate bad things with people who are darker complected, even within races. Okay, so even African-American people will associate more criminal behavior with darker skin people. So why should you care about any of this? Well, the reason that we should care is that our biases impact our decision-making, even though they're subconscious, unconscious biases. They affect our decision-making. And when our prejudicial beliefs impact how we treat others, it can create inequality and it can create inequity. And I'll give you a few examples, and then we'll talk about how this plays out in education. But before I go there, I want to talk about one other thing. And that is the idea of microaggressions, because microaggressions are how implicit biases typically manifest. So microaggressions are slights, insults, denigrating messages, and indignities that people use without thinking that they're offensive. They happen all the time to people who are in minoritized groups, and often the people who are committing them are completely unaware of the fact that they're committing them. So some examples that people say that are microaggressions are on my screen. So that's so gay. That is a microaggression. Okay, because inherent in that statement is that if you are gay, you're not good enough, you're not enough. You're the least scary Black guy I know. These are things I've actually heard people say. Saying to a woman, an engineer, wouldn't you be better as a flight attendant? Or you're cute for an Asian. Are you like 9/11 Muslim, or you like pray 5 times a day Muslim? I don't even think of you as Black. No, where are you really from? That's what people hear when they're, if they're ethnic, is like, you can't possibly be from America if you don't look, like pure white, whatever pure white means. You're so articulate. That's one that I get all the time. And I hate that so much because it assumes that Black folks are supposed to sound completely illiterate. Or I've actually heard a tutor say this to one of my staff members about a student. You don't think she's really gonna earn her GED, do you? Or folks whose ethnicity isn't clear, they hear, what are you? Those are all microaggressions. Those are all comments that someone may say without realizing how incredibly insulting they are. Yep, Justin, you talk so well. Exactly. We hear them all the time. And people don't mean it to be offensive, but it's incredibly offensive. And so one of the things that we have to do is to start calling out those microaggressions and letting people know, and just getting to the point where we're comfortable having the conversation that, so that wasn't cool. Here's why I found that offensive. And then letting people have an opportunity to say, okay, yes, I understand, what I've said was offensive and how I can fix it. Okay, so there are 3 types of microaggressions, actually. The first is called a micro assault. And the micro assault can be a verbal or nonverbal attack that's actually intended to harm. And I think one of the ones that's been in the media more than anything lately is the Confederate flag shirts, because people think that is it's very inflammatory for some people. And people are like, oh, I just like the flag, or I just like the symbol, or I'm just trying to honor my history and honor my past. But that can be a very, very, or even swastikas. Like those are things that when you display them, the people who that has meaning for, it's very offensive. It's very inflammatory. It can be very insulting. So that's a micro assault. Then there's a micro insult. The micro insult is the insensitive communication that demeans someone's identity. And then there's the micro invalidation, which is when you negate the thoughts and experiences of someone else. So if your lady friend says to you, I feel like my boss is treating me differently because I'm a woman. You're like, oh, it's all in your head. That is a micro invalidation. So there are 3 different types of microaggressions that we should really kind of pay attention to. So I want to talk about microaggressions in the medical field. So the very first thing is that there are lots of studies that they're doing in the medical field to see how race and bias impact medical care. But one study, they used vignettes to look at how pediatricians handled and treated their patients. And one of the things that came up from that study is that when if a doctor has a stronger pro-white bias on this implicit association test, which the link is in the chat. Thank you, TJ. If doctors are more on that, if they have a higher pro-white bias, they're more likely to prescribe painkillers to white patients than they are to Black patients. And so if someone has a lower pro-white bias, then they kind of tend to prescribe medication a little bit more equitably. So this is something that has real impacts for real people, people's lives, people's health. Same thing with the judicial system. In the judicial system, bias is played out in a lot of different ways. So we won't even talk about policing because this is only a 1-hour session, but African Americans are only 12% of our population, but they represent 48% of those who are incarcerated in America. That is definitely because of bias. So there's one study that looked at biases, and what they found is that most of the bias that they saw in this one particular study was related to arrest patterns and not necessarily to judicial patterns. So another study looked at judicial patterns, and what they found was whether a person was Black or white, the more Afrocentric their features were, the longer their sentences were. So compared to people who had more European features. So even if you were white, if you looked more African-American, you could commit the same crime and maybe get a longer sentence than someone who had more European features. So it's just like, and part of that again is because that's what we see when you're looking at movies. Everyone has a tiny noses, and what I mean? Like they all kind of have almost the same predictable facial features. That's what Hollywood considers as beautiful. Well, we all internalize those messages, and those messages impact our decision-making, whether we think about it or not. Okay, so now let's talk about what this looks like in education, because that's why we should really care. In education, it can play out in a lot of different ways. So first of all, the way that we fund education differently, like we make sure that we know that schools are not funded equitably. We use funding structures that make it easier for suburban schools or schools with majority white students to get funding and resources that urban schools and majority Black schools, Black and Latino schools don't get. Our policies even can be. So I would say for adult literacy educators to think about your own policies. What are your admission policies like? What are your attendance policies like? Do they create barriers for different people differently? So what are your, for our program at Seeds of Literacy, students can come into class whatever time they want during our class session. And they're not penalized if their bus is late. And where I've worked in other programs where if a student wasn't on site within 15 minutes, they would lock the doors, right? So what about, how are your policies making things different? And what are the judgments that you're making about your students that are allowing you to implement those policies? I think one thing that we should think about when we're creating policies for our students in education is, would I do that? Would I want someone, is that a policy that I would follow? Is that a policy that I would want to be implemented on me? I worked in a program when I first started teaching in adult literacy, and one of the administrators was just very, very, I don't know why she was overly concerned with, she wasn't even a part of our program, but it bothered her so much if our male students had their baseball caps on in class. And to me, that was more of a economic bias. She felt like they shouldn't have them on because that's not what she, and it could have been generational as well. She didn't feel like they should have had hats on in class. And my feeling was, if there's a student who can't afford to get a haircut and he's going to be worried about his hair instead of focusing on his algebra, let him wear the hat, right? So thinking about how our policies might either enable a student to attend despite their differences, or how our policies might in fact impact our female students or our immigrant students or our non-native English speakers or our African American students or our poor students. How might our policies impact students differently, and how do we mediate those differences? I know for sure, I teach at Cleveland State University part-time, and one of the big conversations we're having now is around helping English language learners, because these kids are coming to this country through no fault of their own. They're plopped in English speaking classes, and they basically either have to sink or swim because there just aren't a lot of resources for that. Why aren't we designing our policies differently given that reality? So in adult education, can we think about what are some of our policies that we implement in our school, and how might they show our bias toward our students? Do we look at our students as equal partners in the education transaction, or do we look at them as the beneficiaries and ourselves as, the ones with all the goods, right? Or do we see that they also have something to offer our programs? Are they included in our decision making? Are their lenses brought to the table? So when we're making a decision and we say, oh, well, here's what our students, if we're making a decision and we're thinking, oh, well, we should do this for, our students should do this and that. That's the one thing that I really love about working at Seeds of Literacy is our CEO is very, very intentional about making sure that students are involved in our decision making at every level. Well, not on the board of directors, but outside of the board of directors, we have students at every, we involve them in every decision that we're making, and we're taking their feedback to see how will they perceive our policies, and is there some type of are our biases from our experiences preventing us from making policies that make sense for them? There's another literacy program in Cleveland. I won't name the program. I didn't know they had a literacy program until like 2 or 3 weeks ago, and I got a flyer. So I went on their website to just kind of see what their program was about. And the first thing I encountered was this list of rules. And it was so offensive. Like just reading it, I was getting angry and felt so disrespected. And I'm just thinking, why would that be the first thing that you greet students with if they find their way to your website? Especially, students are going to the web to find resources during COVID. So why would you greet them with everything that they can't do and all of your punishments? It's like, these are adults. That makes no sense. But there is that socioeconomic bias that makes us treat people who are not wealthy, people who are in poverty, in almost a punitive and deficit-based way. So it can impact our interactions with our students. If we have a deficit-focused approach to our students, then we're going to have lower expectations for them, and they'll internalize those low expectations. And beyond that, if we have low expectations on our students based on who they are, our effort's going to be different, right? If you think a student doesn't deserve your time and effort, you're not going to pull out all your resources. We've all had a student who just showed us so much promise, and we were willing to go to bat for that student and give them every resource available. That should be how we treat all of our students, right? So to ask ourselves, like, what might be keeping us from doing that? Is there someone? Okay, sorry. I got a quick, someone's in your waiting room, and then it disappeared. So the next question is, then what can I do? So first, I think the first thing is we can educate ourselves about implicit bias. Again, we all have it. It's just a matter of figuring out, oh my gosh, I got to share this story. So this, I didn't include this in the slideshow because I couldn't find it. But I read this article not long after George Floyd was murdered, and it was written by this man who was from Boston, Massachusetts. And I think this is an excellent example of implicit bias. And so what he was saying is that he was working, he was reading a newspaper, or he'd heard a news story, and in the news story, he heard about this girl who gotten shot in the crossfire of a shooting, and she died. She was like 14. And in his mind, he was like, oh, that's terrible, a 14-year-old died. And then he just kind of went on back to his life, right? And so when he saw that paper, he saw the story in the newspaper later, and it had a picture of the young girl, and the picture of the girl was white. In his mind, he'd assumed that she was a Black girl because white girls don't get shot in the crossfires or shootings, I guess. For him, based on his bias. And he said, like, his article was a reflection that it bothered me that I felt bad. I felt worse when I realized that that 14-year-old girl was a white girl. Like it was like too bad when I found out she was 14, but it was so much worse when I found out that she was white. And the reason that this story was so powerful is because he then said, my wife is a Black woman and my son is biracial. And I didn't realize that I had this pro-white bias while I'm laying next to this Black woman and raising this Black boy in this country. So we have to be aware, like really start to question some of the decisions that we make and start asking ourselves questions like, when we have a reaction to a student, we might want to ask, would I have reacted the same way if the student was my same race? Would I have reacted the same way if the student was in my same socioeconomic class? So educate yourself about implicit bias. You may want to try taking the implicit bias test. You might want to start reading different materials on implicit bias, and I'll have some references in my presentation, which you're all going to get copies of. Call out bias when you notice it, particularly in your organizations. And I don't say call it out like to make it confrontational, but call it out to increase awareness, because it's called unconscious implicit bias for a reason. People aren't always aware of it. And I think one thing is to keep that image of the lens in your mind, that when I watch that interaction between you and a student through my lens of being an African-American female, here's what I saw. And so it's more about what you perceived and what you think the impact was than it was on the person's intent. So it kind of takes the guilt out of the conversations. Let's see. And yes, thank you, Emily. I appreciate that comment too. So call it out when you notice it. Another thing that you can do is think about stereotype replacement. That's a strategy that you can use. And stereotype replacement is recognizing something as stereotypical, recognizing something that you said is stereotypical, like, oh, well, give it to Lee Chin. She's good at math, right? That is a very stereotypical comment. That is a microaggression. It's a positive one, but Asian students will say, like, I hate that people assume I'm good at math. First of all, it puts a lot of pressure on me that I'm supposed to know this math that I'm not comfortable with. So when you see it, recognize it, label it, and then identify why it's stereotypical and what it is that's giving you that image. Is it because those are the images that we see in our media? Yep. And then you act on it and think of an alternate response. You know what? I didn't mean to say that. I know I've said that because of the stereotypes I say in the media. I need to really check myself on that. So you have to be present in those conversations. Think about counter stereotype imaging. So if you have a stereotypical view in your mind of something, find another image and start feeding those images to yourself in the same way that we've been fed the stereotypical images that divide us over all of these years. Consider individuation. Individuation is saying, okay, let me just try to put myself in your shoes. Like, this is what I saw through my lens, but let me see how this would look like if I was in this perspective. So if I was a female student and a male teacher said this to me, how would I feel? So trying to really,
this is
you're not muted. Can
crazy. You can't get out of the chat.
Can you mute, please? Hello. Let me see if I can get this person muted. Hang on one second. I'm sorry, everybody. Okay. So individuation. Then there's perspective taking, trying to take the perspective of, just mute it. Why is it not muted? Okay. Trying to take the perspective of another person and trying to really stand in their shoes. And then having increased interaction with folks outside of your group. The best way to kill bias and stereotypes is to find someone who actually does kill it. I think that people often, if they say it, like one thing that I've heard from people is like, you know, here's what I thought about Black women, but like after I met you, like it kind of made me get rid of those. It made me get rid of those thoughts. If you don't have any interactions with people outside of your group, it's very easy to remain ignorant of the things that are ignorant of the bias that does exist in you. So you have to kind of step outside of your own comfort zone and step outside of your own circle. And again, looking for diversity in your staff, looking for diversity in your board, looking for diversity in your volunteer base. All of those things really help to bring those perspectives to the table and to create spaces where you can have those conversations to check your bias at the door. Also know that if there's a gap between our students' cultures and ours, it's actually our responsibility to bridge that gap, not theirs. So that's something that we also have to be really conscious of. And then also think about questioning your cultural assumptions. Like one cultural assumption I think that everyone in adult literacy should really think about is the idea of meritocracy, right? Because we see every day that some of our students are extremely hard workers and they're very dedicated parents and they're, you know, really committed to their studies, but they are still struggling financially. So this whole idea that if you just pick yourself up by your bootstraps and apply yourself, that you should be successful, what that implies is that everybody who's successful isn't trying and they're lazy and they're not putting forth the effort. And it just reinforces that stereotype that is really divisive and and unproductive. And then the last thing is really make diversity, equity, and inclusion a part of the culture of your organization, which means that attending this session is probably step 2 or 3 for you, but there are probably 15 more steps to go to get to where we're starting to eliminate bias and really look for equitable opportunities and outcomes for all of our students. Are there any questions? Right, Diana, what happens if you don't have any boots? That's the thing that drives me crazy. And the people who usually say, pick yourself up from your bootstraps are people who never have been in a situation where they had to do that. And it drives me insane. Okay. Oh, thank you, Elliot. No questions? So the recordings for all of the OA sessions will be made available to everyone and they'll be available for a while. So you can always come back to that if you want to. We're also sharing our slide presentation. So if you'd like to see any of those, you'll have those and you'll have some of the references and resources that I recommend as well. All right, I don't see questions. I see lots of thank yous. Thank all of you. It's always nice to see a good group of folks who are interested in this topic. Thank you, Teresa. That's funny. Wait, I had to take a picture of that one for my siblings because they think I'm just a regular old knucklehead still from, you know. All right. Well, thank you so much, everybody. I'm glad that you got something from it. This was actually my first time doing this session, so I'm glad that, yeah, Teresa's comment wins the session. All right, well, enjoy the rest of the conference. It's a great one. I'm very excited. One of my colleagues from Seeds of Literacy is going to be presenting on retention with a side of COVID this afternoon. So I'm sure a lot of people will be interested in that one as well. And if you have any questions, I'll stick around for a little bit.